Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be diving into the world of civil lawsuits
Okay.
and tackling a question that's honestly way more complex than it seems at first glance. Who actually gets to participate
Right.
in these legal battles?
Okay.
You've provided us with a stack of legal documents that really lay out the intricate rules that determine, who's in and who's out when it comes to a lawsuit. And we're here to kind of help you navigate.
It's a maze.
Yeah, it's a legal maze.
Absolutely.
I don't know about you, but as we were prepping for this deep dive, I was surprised to find out just how many unexpected
Oh, yeah.
players there can be in a lawsuit. I always thought of it as, pretty straightforward, one person suing another.
Well, and it can be, but it can get much more complicated. The law has to sort of balance those individual rights that you were talking about and making sure the system is fair and efficient for everybody.
Yeah.
And that can be a challenge. So you see that reflected in things like who has standing to actually sue, who must be involved to make it a fair outcome for everybody. And then all these rules around more complex things like assigning claims or subrogation.
Let's start with something that sounds simple but quickly gets complicated, the real party and interest requirement. So this basically means that the person filing a lawsuit has to be the one who actually holds the legal right to make that claim,
Right.
which, again, on the surface sounds simple, but
It does. And then you get into these scenarios, like let's just take debt collection, for example.
Yeah.
You might assume that if a debt collector is calling you, that they're the original creditor.
Right.
But a lot of times what's happened is that the original creditor has assigned the right to collect that debt to somebody else. So, instead of getting a call from, say, your credit card company, now you're hearing from a debt collector, and they've stepped into the shoes of the original creditor.
exactly. And then there's
And that changes things.
and then there's subrogation, where an insurance company steps in and sues on behalf of their policyholder. So let's say, just as an example, your car gets damaged in an accident
Okay.
and your insurance company pays for the repairs.
Right.
They might then sue the person who's responsible for the accident to recover those costs.
Right. So they're the ones with the financial stake in the outcome at that point,
Exactly.
even though they weren't the ones who were originally injured.
It's almost like they're taking over the right.
They are. They're stepping into the shoes of the policyholder in that case.
Exactly. And this applies to a surprisingly wide range of scenarios. In fact, the documents that you gave me actually highlight this really interesting case involving trust deed trustees. And now you would think a trustee would need to be directly impacted to take legal action. But in this case, even though they weren't traditional trustees, they still had the power to initiate foreclosure proceedings
Wow.
on behalf of the beneficiaries.
So even if they weren't personally losing money, they were authorized to act on behalf of those who were standing in their shoes, kind of like that insurance company we were just talking about.
Yeah, exactly. And this really underscores why understanding the real party and interest is so crucial, because it tells you who you can legally pursue for a claim and who might have the right to come after you.
Absolutely.
You definitely don't want to find yourself in a legal battle with someone that you didn't even realize had a stake in the game.
It's like playing chess and finding out your opponent has an extra queen you didn't know about.
Exactly. Now, let's talk about capacity for a second.
Okay.
It seems obvious, but not everyone is legally allowed to participate in a lawsuit.
This is where the law steps in to protect certain people who might not be able to navigate the legal system on their own or represent themselves effectively. So we're talking about minors, people who, for whatever reason, don't have the capacity to make decisions, or even corporations who've been suspended, maybe because they haven't paid their taxes.
No, it's not just having a legal right. It's about having the ability to understand and engage in the process itself.
Right. Exactly. And so sometimes you get these situations that seem a little unfair. One of the documents actually highlighted a case where someone's suing an unrepresented minor, and because they're a minor, they have the right to void any judgment that's made against them, even if the other side wins. But if they win, they can still enforce it.
So it's like a legal heads I win, tails you lose kind of situation.
Right. It is.
Which is a pretty significant.
Huge advantage. And it highlights how tricky these capacity issues can get.
Absolutely. And understanding these nuances can help you avoid, pouring time and resources into a lawsuit that can't proceed because someone lacks capacity. Or even protect yourself if someone lacking capacity tries to sue you.
Right.
It's all about knowing the rules of the game before stepping onto that playing field.
Absolutely.
And speaking of the legal playing field, let's move on to a concept that really adds another layer of complexity to all of this compulsory joinder of parties.
Yeah.
This is where the court steps in and says, hey, even if you don't want this person involved, they need to be part of this lawsuit for it to be fair.
Right. Compulsory joinder is about making sure we have a complete and fair resolution to whatever the dispute is. So if there's somebody whose interests are so intertwined with the case that leaving them out would just create an unfair result or an incomplete outcome, the court can say, nope, they have to be involved, even if the original people, the plaintiff and the defendant, don't want that.
So it's almost like the court saying, we need all the key players at the table to make sure that this is decided properly.
Absolutely. And that's where the concept of indispensable parties comes into play. These are the people that are so critical to the case that it just can't go forward without them. If you try to leave them out, the whole case might get dismissed.
So there's a difference between like someone who would be helpful to have in a lawsuit and someone whose presence is absolutely essential.
You got it. There's necessary parties. They might have good information. You might want them there, but it's not going to derail everything if they're not. Indispensable means that without them, the whole thing falls apart.
That's a crucial distinction. Imagine being sued and then finding out that a key player, someone who could completely change the outcome, isn't even involved. Like it could completely change the balance of power.
It absolutely can. And that's why it's so important for anybody who thinks they might be involved in a lawsuit to understand these rules. Knowing when someone's absence is a problem or when you might be able to force someone to join can really protect you.
Yeah, it's like realizing that your opponent in a poker game is missing a crucial card.
Yeah.
You might play your hand differently if you knew that card was like out of the equation.
Absolutely.
So, okay, so we've talked about the real party in interest, who initiates the lawsuit,
Right.
the importance of capacity to participate, and situations where the court steps in and says you need more players in this game.
Right.
It's clear that determining who gets to be part of a lawsuit is way more complex than it might appear at first glance.
It is. And we're just scratching the surface here, but hopefully what we've talked about today gives you a better sense of how the system tries to make sure things are fair and complete.
And don't forget, this is just part one of our deep dive into the world's civil lawsuits. In the next part, we'll explore even more scenarios that impact who can participate in these legal battles. So, stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the very intricate world of civil lawsuits. In part one, we tackled the real party and interest requirement, the importance of capacity to sue, and kind of got a taste of how the court can really shake things up with compulsory joinder. But now let's really unpack those situations where the court steps in and says, hold on, we need more players on this field for a fair game.
Yeah, it's like a legal referee making sure everybody who deserves a seat at the table gets one.
Exactly.
As you said, compulsory joinder is all about making sure we get a complete and fair resolution to the dispute. And sometimes that means bringing in parties who maybe aren't so excited about participating. It almost sounds like herding cats, trying to get everyone with a stake in the outcome to actually cooperate and, present their case.
You're not wrong. But luckily, the legal system provides some tools to manage that. So the court can issue an order saying, you have to join this lawsuit. And if that party really digs in their heels and refuses, the court can actually dismiss the whole case.
Wow. So there's a real risk for those who try to kind of, dodge the court summons.
Yeah.
I guess it's a reminder that when it comes to lawsuits playing by the rules, even if you'd rather just sit on the sidelines, is often the wisest course of action.
Absolutely. Think of it this way. Compulsory joinder isn't just about protecting the people who are already directly involved in the dispute. It's about protecting the integrity of the whole legal system.
Okay.
So it's saying we're not just going to let this case go forward with a potentially messed up outcome because somebody's decided to step out. We want a result that everybody can trust and that really addresses all the relevant angles.
So it's like saying, we need a resolution that everyone can trust.
Yeah.
That addresses all the relevant angles.
Right. We want to make sure we don't end up with two different courts saying two different things or decisions that don't make sense. And a lot of times, you can't do that without all the key players there.
Okay, so we know the court has the authority to kind of bring in these additional parties, but I'm curious about the legal tests they apply. Like, how do they determine if a party is truly indispensable? It can't be as simple as, hey, I think this person should be involved.
It would be nice if it were that easy,
Yeah.
but it's not quite that simple. There's actually a pretty clear legal framework. Courts usually look at two main things. First, they think about whether the absent party's rights would actually be affected if the case goes ahead without them. So we're talking about protecting their legal interests and making sure they're not left out in the cold.
Okay, so it's not enough to just have, like, an interest in the outcome.
Yeah.
They need to show their actual legal rights are on the line.
Exactly. And the second thing courts consider is whether going ahead without this missing person would create a risk of conflicting rulings or judgments.
No.
Remember, the whole goal is to get to a final decision that everybody has to follow. So if leaving someone out could lead to contradictory outcomes or even more lawsuits down the road, that's a big problem.
Yeah, it's almost like trying to solve a puzzle without all the pieces. You might end up with a picture that doesn't quite make sense.
That's a great way to put it. Let's imagine this. Let's say there's a dispute over who owns a valuable antique.
Okay.
And two people go to court to fight about it, but there's a third person out there who might also have a claim, but they're nowhere to be found.
Oh, that's a recipe for disaster. What happens if the court decides in favor of one of the parties, but then that missing person shows up and says, hey, wait a minute, that antique's mine?
That's exactly what compulsory joinder tries to prevent.
Okay.
In a case like that, the court would probably say that missing person is indispensable. And they would either try to force them to join the case, or if that's not possible, just dismiss the whole thing.
It really makes you realize that even if you think you have a super strong case, overlooking this whole idea of compulsory joinder could really backfire.
Yeah, it's like thinking you've won a marathon, but you accidentally skipped a lap.
Exactly.
And, the documents you provided actually talk about a bunch of other situations where this comes up. Like, in cases about partnerships, courts often require all the partners to be involved, even if only two of them are arguing.
So it's not just about resolving that one little dispute between two individuals. It's about protecting the interests of the whole partnership. It's like making sure all the members of a band are on the same page, even if a couple of them are, I don't know, having a creative disagreement or something.
That's a great way to think about it. And that same principle applies to other kinds of groups, too. Corporations, LLCs, you name it. So if a shareholder sues a corporation, the court might require other shareholders to be involved, or even the company's officers and directors.
It's like the court is saying, look, we get that you have this specific problem, but we need to think about how this affects the whole organization, not just the people who are arguing right now.
Right. Now, a question you might be thinking is, what happens when you just can't get somebody to join, no matter how important they are?
Yeah, that's a good point. It seems like there could be situations where it's just impossible for practical reasons.
Absolutely. And this is where that difference between necessary and indispensable that we talked about before really matters. If someone is necessary but not indispensable, the case might be able to continue.
Okay.
But if they're really essential and leaving them out would make it impossible to get a fair result, the court might have no choice but to dismiss the whole thing.
Wow. So even if you have, like, a rock-solid legal argument,
Yeah.
the whole thing could fall apart if there's a crucial party that's just out of reach. It's a good reminder that sometimes you win or lose a legal battle, not just on the facts of the case, but on these procedural grounds,
Absolutely. And there are lots of reasons why someone might be impossible to join. Maybe they live in another country, so they're outside of the court's jurisdiction.
Right.
Or maybe the time limit for filing a claim has expired, so they can't get involved anymore.
So even if they're holding, like, the missing piece of the puzzle, those legal hurdles can make it impossible to bring them to the table.
Unfortunately, that's right. And when that happens, the court has a tough choice to make. They have to weigh how important that absence party is against the practicality of moving forward without them. The documents you gave me actually list a whole bunch of factors they consider. Things like, would it be unfair to the people already involved to continue? Could they even come up with a decision that protects everyone's interests? Could they maybe move the case to a different court that does have power over that missing person?
Wow. It sounds like such a delicate balancing act with the court trying to, like, juggle all these legal rules and practical limitations.
It is. And their decision can literally make or break the entire case. If they decide a crucial party just can't be joined, it might be game over, even if the arguments are really strong on both sides.
It's a reminder that even when you have, like, a really strong legal claim, those procedural obstacles can be impossible to overcome.
It's true.
It highlights how important it is to get good legal advice early on, so you can understand these potential issues and come up with a good strategy.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, so as we wrap up this part on compulsory joinder, remember, this is just one piece of the huge puzzle that's civil litigation. There's so much more to explore.
There is.
In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to be talking about another fascinating scenario that can totally change a lawsuit: intervention. So stay tuned. Welcome back to the deep dive.
We're in the final stretch of our exploration into the world of civil lawsuits. And so far, we've uncovered quite a few, twists and turns.
Absolutely.
We tackled the real party and interest requirement, the complexities of capacity.
And we really dug deep into those situations where the court steps in and says, hey, you need more players through compulsory joinder.
You need a bigger table.
Exactly. But today, we're shifting gears a little bit to examine what happens when someone who wasn't initially part of the lawsuit decides they want in on the action.
They want a piece of this.
Yeah.
This is where it gets interesting. It's like, that friend who just has to jump into any conversation that's happening, even if they weren't originally part of the group.
Yeah.
That's kind of what's going on here, but in legal terms. We call it intervention. And it basically allows outsiders to become parties to a lawsuit that's already in progress because they think the outcome could really affect them.
Okay, so it's not just wanting to be involved for, the drama of it.
Right.
They have a real stake in how things play out.
A dog in the fight, as they say.
Exactly. But I imagine the court doesn't just let anyone jump in whenever they feel like it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. There are rules, of course. Just like with that joinder stuff we were talking about before.
Yeah.
There are actually two main types of intervention. Intervention as of right, and then there's permissive intervention.
Okay, let's untangle those two for a second. What makes someone have a right to intervene?
Okay.
As opposed to, just asking politely to be part of the lawsuit?
Good question. So intervention as of right happens when a non-party's interest is so closely tied to what the lawsuit's about that their legal rights would actually be affected by the outcome, whether they're there or not. The court basically has no choice but to let them in.
So it's not just about, having an opinion or a preference about how things should go.
Nope.
Their actual legal rights are on the line.
Right. Think about a classic property dispute.
Right.
Let's say there's a lawsuit going on over who owns a piece of land. And somebody comes along and says, hold on, that's my property you're fighting about.
Yeah.
They have a right to intervene, to come in and make their case.
That makes perfect sense. You wouldn't want a judgment about a piece of property to be made without letting everyone who says they own it have a chance to speak up.
Right. Otherwise, you're just asking for another lawsuit later.
Exactly. Exactly.
And contracts can trigger this too, especially if they're set up to benefit a third party. So let's say two people sign an agreement. One agrees to do something for the other.
Okay.
But the contract says that some third person is actually going to get the benefit of that work. Well, if those two original people start fighting about the contract, that third person can step right in and say, hey, wait a minute, my rights are at stake here.
So even though they weren't physically there when the contract was signed,
right,
their rights are still directly tied to the terms of that contract.
Exactly. They were kind of an invisible beneficiary until things went south, and now they're stepping into the light.
I like that. And are these rights just limited to individuals?
Nope. Corporations, government agencies, all kinds of groups can assert this right if they think a lawsuit could really impact them.
Okay, that makes sense. So intervention as of right is all about those situations where someone's legal rights are totally tied up with a lawsuit, whether they were part of the original problem or not. What about permissive intervention? When does the court have, more wiggle room to decide who gets to join the party?
Okay, so permissive intervention is a little more relaxed. This is when someone has an interest in the case, but it might not be strong enough to give them that automatic right to intervene.
So they're interested, but not necessarily entitled to participate. It's like wanting to join a game that's already started.
Right.
You might have skills to contribute, but it's really up to the people who are already playing to decide if you're a good fit.
Exactly. And in these situations, the court's like a referee. They weigh a bunch of different things to figure out if letting this new person in would be fair and if it would work, practically speaking.
So it's a lot more of a judgment call.
Yeah.
The court has to balance the intervener's interest with how it might impact the lawsuit that's already going on.
Exactly. And one of the big things they think about is whether that potential intervener's interests are already being looked after by one of the existing parties.
Okay.
If so, they might say, look, You don't need to jump in. Your concerns are already being addressed.
It's like saying, we already have someone speaking for you. You don't need to repeat what they're saying.
Exactly. So imagine a case where someone's challenging some environmental regulations. Let's say a company is being sued for violating clean air standards.
Okay.
An environmental group might try to intervene to present evidence or arguments about why those standards should be even stronger.
Okay, so their goal kind of aligns with the plaintiffs in the sense that they both want the company to be held accountable.
Right.
But the environmental group brings this whole other level of, like, expertise on the actual impact on the environment.
Right. But the court would still have to decide if letting them in would just make the case more complicated and take longer without actually adding anything new to the discussion.
It sounds like a tough balancing act, really. Trying to make sure everything's fair and efficient, but also preventing the lawsuit from becoming, like, too unwieldy.
Absolutely. It's like trying to conduct a big orchestra, right?
Right.
You want all the instruments to play their part, but you also need somebody to make sure everything's in sync and we get to a good ending.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And as with any complicated system, I think understanding the rules makes all the difference.
I think so too.
You know, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. From the real party in interest to all these nuances of intervention.
Yeah.
And it's clear that figuring out who actually gets to participate in a lawsuit is rarely a simple question.
It rarely is.
The rules around standing, capacity, joinder, and intervention, they all play a critical role in making sure things are fair and complete and that we get a just outcome.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And remember, this is just a peek into the massive world of civil lawsuits. There's always more to learn,
Absolutely.
more layers to uncover, and new challenges popping up all the time.
That's what makes it so fascinating.
It does.
And to everyone listening, you know, if you're facing a legal challenge yourself, remember that knowledge is power. Understanding these concepts can really help you make good decisions.
Absolutely.
Advocate for yourself and navigate the complexities of the system with more confidence. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of civil lawsuits. We hope you found it insightful, and until next time, stay curious.